Alrighty, this is the audio review for Pulling It All Together, or maybe it's Putting It All Together? I don't remember. And women's rights as human rights. Alright, so what can I do? So learning about social injustices can be a bit overwhelming, right? When we see the complexity of social issues or how pronounced and institutionalized issues of race, class, gender, sexuality, and all these other issues we talked about, how, institutionalized they are, it can be disheartening. It can leave us feeling helpless and hopeless for a positive future. So that's why it's important to develop an intersectional perspective and act on it. It's complicated developing that intersectional perspective. It requires a lot of us to be introspective, to challenge our stereotypes and our assumptions, all these things we've been taught or just accepted as we've aged. So we have to be real about our privileges and the way they've shaped our lives, which is really a lifelong and sometimes very painful process. So we need to remember that, those concepts we've talked about, the matrix of domination and others, that talk about how our perspective is really shaped by our social location. So where we are in the hierarchy affects the way we see the world. And that can really help us understand and see different perspectives and understand and be able to kind of look at the complicated relationships between these factors, and see how oppressions are linked and see how these things can be systematically dismantled. So what motivates people to work for social justice? All of us have issues we care about, right? And these spur us towards social justice causes. It could be our families, if you have kids, it could be your kid, your neighborhoods, or really even faith motivates a lot of people towards social change. So most people who engage in activism are normal, everyday people. They're just someone who was touched by something that pushes them to act, right? So a good example of that would be the Marjory Stoneman Douglas students, high school, right, and the March for Our Lives movement, where these kids were the victims of, they basically survived a very tragic mass shooting, and they decided to turn that into an activist cause to call for, gun reform and changes to, the ability of people to get weapons that leads to, a lot of these issues of gun violence in America, that we have, this epidemic of gun deaths that aren't taken seriously, right? And how they basically were just normal kids going to high school. And then one day, a bunch of their classmates were murdered in front of them, and that galvanized them to do something about it, right? To not just be happy with the thoughts and prayers, but to actually try to move something forward. And it's really amazing seeing how, impactful a group of, teenagers have been on changing perceptions of public policy and what could be done as a result of those movements, right? Another example would be Tarana Burke, right, forming the Me Too movement and trying to create a space for survivors of, these horrific issues like rape and sexual assault to have a place to form a community of people that understand what they're going through, that don't re-victimize them or traumatize them or, kind of see them as at fault in the kind of rape culture ideology for their own victimization, right? And how essential that Me Too movement became to actually taking down some of the most powerful men, like, for example, in the entertainment industry and others, politics. Unfortunately not resolved in politics yet, but we're getting there. To really try to address all of these issues. And another thing I would usually show you in class, unfortunately I can't, is a clip from this documentary about the environmental rights movement called Fear Screen Fire that shows this movement, which is called, it's basically galvanized around what was called Love Canal. It was this interesting kind of 70s time period of, what was it called? A toxic waste dump with 10,000 barrels of toxic waste that was dumped in a community called Love Canal, and how it started leaking all the toxic waste out, and it was causing these horrific birth defects and abnormalities in the children, causing all of these illnesses for all the people that lived there and horrific cancer rates. And it basically was Lois Gibbs going door to door getting people to sign a petition that she realized just how widespread the problem was. And all of these, kind of disrespected housewives formed their own movement that, eventually, you gotta love Lois, the lady who was leading it, who literally took an EPA official hostage to try to get the point across that they needed to be relocated. Like, there's this one in the clip I wish I could show you. Actually, you could probably find it free online. Fierce Green Fire, Love Canal. There's this interesting interview they do with this woman where they won't relocate her, but they tell her, don't go in your basement because it's too toxic. Make sure your kids never go in the basement. Make sure you always wear shoes when you're in your lawn, right, because of the toxic chemicals. Don't plant a vegetable garden or anything like that because it'll be poisonous, but enjoy your home, right? We're not going to relocate you. Enjoy your home. And it's like, how likely are you to be able to sell that house? You're not. There's toxic waste there. So, it was those movements, like having those housewives that were disrespected by local and state officials, that then even went to the national level. I mean, there was intervention from the President of the United States. It shows how just a small group of people collectivizing over an issue can really change it. And some of it comes from that NIMBY, not my backyard thing of, people often get started in these activist things on little local issues or things that affect them either personally or affect people in their communities. And as a result of that kind of work and activism, people start to realize just how much of an impact a small group of people can have when they're focused and working towards alleviating social justice issues. So if you look at your own life and your own values and think about how you could be a force for positive change in your community, right? How could you help your neighborhood, right? Or your larger community? What could you do? Whether it be, volunteering or activism or whatever it might be, something that can cause a positive impact, right? To kind of push back against these issues of inequalities. So possessing a vision of equality is very important. Having an ethical framework that can help us see how equality can be achieved. So we need to be on the same page in order to create lasting social change, and that can be very difficult, right? So when we look at change in society or how to change society for the future, we have to just make sure we're not doing what people did in the past. So we have to make sure we're not leaving anyone out of the analysis. Basically, that we're being inclusive, right? And that we're representing the interests of all people, not just the ones who currently hold power, that we're able to look past our own noses and include people that have different perspectives, different marginalities, different issues than we personally do. So another part of this is looking inside the system and outside the system. So in order to change the power structures and social institutions that continue those inequalities in our culture, we have to work on both fronts, right? Inside and outside. So inside can mean that old school liberalism, right? Trying to change the institutional policies and practices that either overtly discriminate based on race, class, gender, sexuality, whatever it might be, or that just end up having unjust outcomes like we talked about with the criminal justice system. Or working outside the system is when some groups, work outside of institutions to create social change by forming social movements, right, that are based on shared goals and use strategies that, are like those that we talked about with the civil rights era, like sit-ins, teach-ins, die-ins, boycotts, picketing, demonstrations, marches, other direct action strategies that bring attention and focus to those problems, right? It's like the very classic Audre Lorde quote that the master's house can't be dismantled, using those tools, those same tools. So you have to be able to work outside of that system. Oh my God, sorry, I terribly butchered what Audre Lorde was saying. But what I mean to say is that, the system itself can't just be dismantled by using the same framework that the system gives you. Sometimes you have to go outside of that, like we saw with when we were talking about the civil rights movement, that a lot of the things that were being done, like sit-ins, were technically illegal, right? But by doing those things, and we see this a lot today, like people, for the environmental climate action movements, people chaining themselves to chase banks so people can't get in or things like that because some banks still invest in fossil fuel companies, right? And they're trying to get them to divest by closing their accounts, by staging protests, things like this, which are technically illegal in a lot of situations. But the whole point of them is to bring attention to a social cause, working outside of that system. Of course, it's outside the system because it's not mandated. It's not friendly, right? A lot of people have a problem with protests because they're not friendly, right? Like especially in LA, I hear this a lot whenever any sort of group closes down the freeway to make an action, or any of those kind of public transit centers, people get really pissed, like, oh, what, my commute's going to be worse today? And you're like, yeah, because people are trying to bring attention to like real social problems, that the whole point is to disrupt the system, cause a problem. And I think, honestly, in a capitalistic society, sometimes the most effective versions of that are boycotts, using our financial purchasing power and saying, no, I'm not going to buy any of that crap that oppresses people, right? I'm not going to support, Fox News people that incite violence or, hatred and xenophobia through their, reporting, or actually going back to the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas kids. I mean, you had Laura Ingraham say some really horrible, inflammatory stuff about some teenagers who survived a mass shooting. And what happened? Boycotts. She lost a ton of high-profile sponsors. And it's sad to say, but that's literally the only thing that some people care about, is the bottom line, is how much it financially affects them. And we don't realize how much power we have in that regard. Like, the whole economic system is actually in the pockets of the middle class and the working class. It's not really about the power that the rich have, because they don't spend as much money proportionally as the poor and the, middle class do. Meaning, when you get money, if you got rent, if you got bills, like, you're going to put it right at that, right? Versus if you have a lot of it, you're not necessarily going to spend the same proportionally, right? Like, if you make $1 million more than someone, you're not going to buy 1 million more shoes or 1 million more beds or 1 million more anything. So it doesn't really proportionally work out, right? Anywho, so demonstrations, marches, whatever it might be, but I do think also boycotts are very effective in that way, because it kind of shuts down the economic imperative for this stuff. And then, of course, we have to look beyond our U.S. borders, because first we have to understand that our impact, right, the United States policies, and let's be real, our transnational corporations that are often headquartered here's policies, wreak havoc all over the world. Our imperialist policies affect a lot of people around the world, put them in horrible situations because of, for some reason, it's strategic to us politically to do so. And our government destabilizes democratically elected governments in order to get policies that are more favorable to American corporations, as we saw with El Salvador, right? The killing fields, with Iran-Contra deal, with, the dirty wars, right? And the consequences of our interventions are often multi-generational, and they cause all sorts of social problems, right? So outside of that, the way we consume goods is connected to exploited labor and sweatshops, to pollution and political strife all over the world. So we need to have a global viewpoint to truly understand the complexity of our macro social issues, so we can fully address inequalities and actually have some way to alleviate those problems. But we often kind of like put our, hands over our ears and go la, 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 because we don't want to hear how our choices, our purchases have an impact on the suffering of people all over the world, how our government justifies the murder and the takeover often of democratically elected leaders. Why? So some company can make more money, right? And how our policy and trade is based on that economic exploitation of a lot of countries, even through, the IMF and World Bank and all these other things. So it's important to kind of, and again, I know that we barely learn American history, let alone world history, enough to have a deep context to often understand this. But this is important for us to do. It's important for us to educate ourselves as to what the impacts are of our policies and our decisions, because we often think of ourselves as USA number one, as an island, but all of our positions and policies have that context of all the consequences they cause, and we have to own up to that, right? We can't just pat ourselves on the back and say, great job, when we destabilize places all over the world for economic benefit, right? Who suffers in those situations? The refugees, right? The people who are killed, their families, and the communities, all of the kind of consequences that ripple up. And like I said, for often multiple generations because of interventions that we've caused. So we need to take account of that, and we need to take responsibility for that and make sure that policy that we're creating isn't causing more untold harm. All right, moving on to women's rights as human rights. So the article is talking about having a revision of human rights, right? So again, I know it's a little bit old, but a lot of this stuff is still very relevant in the modern day, right? So the promotion of human rights is a pretty widely accepted goal. It's been established internationally, so incorporating women into this analysis is helpful because the framework is already there. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted in 1948, and as part of it, it says that we should not discriminate based on race, class, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, property, birth order, or status. So since the Declaration, it has been added to a little bit here and there, but little has been said about the issues of gender. And the concept of human rights is not static, right? Just like all other social things, or the property of one group. It's the meanings itself expand as people reconceive of their needs or, retool their hopes in relation to them. So feminists redefine human rights abuses to include the degradation and violation of women in many ways. So moving beyond rhetoric and looking at the political implications, often there's a token commitment to women's equality. So most governments do little more than have some token commitment. So no government determines policies towards other countries based on their treatment of women or their human rights record. So this is a particularly interesting one in the U.S. I've noticed this all the time with politicians. They tend to very conveniently cherry pick when human rights is important. Meaning, if there's a regime or a group that we don't like, then their human rights abuses are wrong. But if they're an ally or a trading partner or someone that we're getting oil from, then we'll just completely turn a blind eye to their human rights abuses and all the negative things that they're doing, right? So when it comes to violence against women and issues of reproductive rights, they're just not included in those discussions of policies for international human rights. And so many offer excuses for not including violence against women or reproductive rights. And they'll say it's because, sex discrimination is just too trivial. It's not an important issue. Or it's just not an issue that's as pressing as others. Or they'll say that abuse of a woman may be regrettable, but it's a cultural or an individual issue, meaning, behind closed doors, that it isn't a political issue that nations should address. Or they'll say that women's rights aren't really a human rights issue per se, right? They'll say that's too exclusionary to only focus on the issues that women face. But, it is, and also, fun fact, women are humans. So they do kind of fall under the banner of humans there. And so if we acknowledge the abuse of women, it's such a pervasive issue, right? And so some people argue, we're not going to be able to address it everywhere, so it's going to overwhelm other human rights issues, so we should just exclude it, right? And so all of this comes down to these kind of value systems or belief systems. So there's this insidious myth that women's rights are trivial and second to the issues of life and death. But in reality, sexism kills, right? During birth, many women die or face complications simply because they don't have equal access or medical systems that respond to their needs. There are countries where men are favored so much over women that female babies are terminated in utero due to their limited social opportunities later in life. During childhood, sexism kills. The World Health Organization reports that girls are fed less, taken to doctors less frequently, breastfed for shorter periods, and die or are physically or mentally maimed by malnutrition at much higher rates than boys, right? So the social desirability of boys that will become men affects the way that we then treat those young girls. Sexism kills in adulthood, right? Many women do not have control over their bodies all over this world. And so this threatens their lives, and this is much more an issue for women in poverty, which obviously results in poor health services. So sex discrimination kills women daily, and we don't take this seriously. And as a result of these insidious myths, we don't address these things in the way that we should. And there's generally a failure to see oppression of women as political, right? Which results in the exclusion of sex discrimination and violence against women from the human rights agenda overall. So it's because patriarchy itself is socially constructed into our politics, into our institutions, into our ideologies. So women being subordinated is often seen as a natural or inevitable kind of result of social hierarchy, instead of being seen as a social problem or as an inequality, right? It's one of those subtle things we take for granted. So the author argues that if we can socially construct this system, then we can dismantle it and construct another, one that has much more equity. So when it comes to politics and control over women, a lot of the political control of women focuses on controlling their bodies. So laws that put control into women's hands are controversial, and there's a lot of resistance to these laws, such as women having control over reproductive rights, right? Being able to choose what you do with your body, somehow controversial. That these are actually much more under attack in the present era than ever before in this country. So even during the COVID-19 pandemic, some places are calling abortions a non-essential service in order to limit even further access in a lot of these places where women barely have access, which I put up a link to that information in your additional resources if you're interested to find out more. But, there's a lot of other laws that focus on control over women that include the freedom of their sexuality for heterosexual and lesbian women, that sexuality can be explored and experienced by women for their own benefit. This is a very controversial, or it was controversial, and honestly is still pretty controversial idea. So we often see women's sexuality as a supporting role for men's. A lot of that heteronormativity and patriarchy gets in the way there. So some think that women need men for sex, right? When it comes to the majority of women do not orgasm from vaginal intercourse, but from clitoral stimulation. So even our notions of heterosexual or homosexual sex are framed in these limiting patriarchal ways. Another issue of control is creating protections to make illegal rape within marriage. For many years, sex was considered a wifely duty, quote unquote. And perpetuating these rigid sex role understandings has human rights implications like sexual assault, physical and emotional abuse of women, sexual terrorism, imprisonment in their homes, violence from their partners. More violence happens to women at home than anywhere else. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that while on the campaign trail in 2016, Donald Trump, one of his lawyers, those guys are great, was questioned about the fact that when Donald Trump divorced his first wife, Ivana, she claimed that he had sexually assaulted her. And she dropped that claim for a settlement. Right? And so what's interesting is, what the lawyer, when he was asked about it, he didn't say like, well, that was handled, or that's not current issue, or that was 40 years ago, whatever, 30 years ago. You know what he said? He said, well, that's impossible. You can't rape your wife. He said that in 2016, which is just not true. Of course you can, because sex is not something that you can just assume someone gives you because you're married. That's not how that works. You still need consent for every sexual encounter, right? So that's something that, again, it's taken for granted. And when we look at issues all around the world, there's a lot of different cultural variations of justification for that same kind of control over someone's body. An example from the reading showed how this control can be taken to the extreme. Like in the case of these women in Thailand who died in a brothel fire because they were chained to their beds. So we see patriarchal notions manifest in a lot of different ways, like justifying the exclusion of women from a decent education or from jobs. So they're either dependent on a spouse, which of course opens the door for coercive control and abuse, or they have to go into exploitive work like prostitution to support themselves and their families. And so those are not real choices, right? They're very exploitive choices. So towards action, some practical approaches. So the classification of human rights is important as it has practical policy implications, meaning human rights are still considered more important than women's rights. And so, women are still getting lesser rights than men, and this social notion makes its way into the governing structures of societies all over the world. When we look at women as less socially important, then the issues that women face we consider less important. So, like living in the rape culture that we don't focus on men or male offenders as the issue. Instead, we bully victims, and we blame them for their behaviors that supposedly made them more vulnerable or liable for the assault on them, because we see it as a women's issue. So like the video from earlier in the class talking about violence, masculinity in the media, if we saw violence against women as a men's issue, we may actually do something about it. But we call it violence against women, which linguistically removes men and makes it seem inevitable. Like he says in the clip, it's like they're just experiencing the weather, right? There's just violence against women. They don't, men linguistically are removed from that analysis. So we don't really think often about the power dynamics in who we even define as worthy as human rights. So some of the, approaches or practical approaches she suggested in the reading was looking at human rights as political and civil rights. So this means raising visibility of women's issues and calling attention to the type of abuse that women suffer just because they're female. So this means documenting the problems of female refugees, right? It's a good example, as women and their children make up about, more than 80% of those people in refugee camps. Yet few policies are shaped to protect the specific issues that women face, like abuse and sexual assault in these contexts. So the example from the reading was one camp where men were allocated rations and women had to exchange sex for more food for them and their children. So this is not just a reflection of a one-time thing or of a reading that was written like decades ago. It actually also happened during the Haitian earthquake relief in, like 2011? So I posted articles in your additional resources about it, where UN peacekeepers that were there to help with the relief actually fathered hundreds of kids from having forced sex interactions, meaning they would offer starving women small amounts of food for them and their kids in exchange for exploitative sex. It's horrible. I mean, you're supposed to be there as a peacekeeper to help people that are being, that are in the consequences of the entire destruction of Port-au-Prince because of this catastrophic earthquake. And people are using that as a way to exploit and denigrate women specifically. So again, and as we talk about these things, I know that we're focusing on women in a kind of, a very specific way. But of course, these are intersectional issues, and it's not as if these things only affect women. It's just almost kind of like the way we talk about Black Lives Matter, that if Black Lives Matter, then all lives matter, versus, if we're only looking at human rights as men's rights and we're not looking at women's rights at all. Like, if we care enough about women's rights, we also care about men's rights. Like, it's just an idea of we need to add the marginal to the overall understanding so we can really respect everyone that's affected by these things. So I did put another thing in your additional resources from that same time period. There was a video where these soldiers were caught on video sexually assaulting a man in Haiti. A couple of the officers are just holding him down while the other person's assaulting him. They don't show all of these. Obviously the clip is like not as triggering. They really just talk about the issues around it. But again, it is pretty awful to see. So again, this is still an ongoing issue. And I honestly suspect that this problem is happening in relation to other social conflicts and disaster recoveries around the world when it comes to, people being the most marginal are the most exploited. So if you have women that are refugees with their children, right, they are incredibly marginal, right? Because they're women, because they're poor, because now they don't have a place to live, and all of these other factors having to try to, fend off starvation for themselves and their children. It just puts people in extremely vulnerable positions. So instead of just helping them, it's awful, right? When people are vulnerable, they're easy to exploit. So female refugees with their kids are about as vulnerable as it gets. And it's just so sad to see people that are supposed to be helping causing actually much more harm. So we also need to think of women's rights as socioeconomic rights. So this is seeing that kind of human right of access to food, shelter, healthcare, employment should also be extended to women, and that we need to work on that, right? So part of this is dealing with social inequalities in education and employment that make women economically dependent on men, which of course opens them up for much more vulnerability for violence, right? So another part of this is looking at the roles that women play in the workforces of developing nations and their markets, such as working in sweatshop labor, which means they're not going to have safety or decent financial compensation. And those safety concerns can lead to issues like we talked about with the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in the early 1900s in New York, or the fire at the plant in Bangladesh almost 100 years later, where women also burned alive in garment factories because the owners locked the doors, afraid that people would steal or union organize. So another issue we previously discussed is the feminization of poverty, the sort of intersectional understandings of poverty and women's marginal status around the globe. So this is important as it shows there are social, political, and financial rewards to this exploitive system, which is why so many fight to prevent women from gaining rights or look to repeal what little protections women have. Like we see here that in the U.S., poverty is not strictly female, but females comprise a large percentage of the poor, and this is related to that marginality and social inequality. Also, we need to look at women's rights and the law. meaning that legal mechanisms seek to make existing legal and political institutions work for women and to expand the state's responsibility for the violation of women's human rights, right? So these measures allow women to fight for their rights within the legal system. For example, sexual harassment is considered a crime in the U.S., and there are laws that punish it and give rights and protections to the victims of it. This does not mean people no longer face harassment, but there's someone to call in HR, right? Which is something that women did not have as a protection in the past. Like when my mom was in college, it was normative that women experience harassment or related unwanted sexual attention and comments from their bosses. Well, once those laws were established, we all have to be trained on what is and what is not appropriate at work, and there's a resource to turn to, right? Which is, it doesn't mean it goes away immediately, but it means there's some sort of way, a mechanism, right? So I feel like this is a good example of what the author's talking about. Because the issue does not disappear, but there's a way to seek justice through the legal mechanism. So we did see how even the most famous and high-profile women experience these issues and have a hard time getting justice, such as those harassed by Bill O'Reilly, by lizard person and former Fox News head Roger Ailes. I mean, look it up. He's straight up a lizard person. Those people that were harassed by Matt Lauer. I mean, who has a button in their office that closes and locks the door? I mean, that is shady as hell. And side note, I think a lot of the coverage about these abuses addressed by the Me Too movement that found that a lot of these high-profile garbage fires had NDAs, or what we call non-disclosure agreements. They forced women to sign these NDAs so they were financially compensated for their abuse. And so the consequence, though, is that this person has to promise they'll never tell a soul what happened. So those abusers can carry on over and over. And many corporations work by NDA, as did the monster Harvey Weinstein, right? So again, the legal system matters, as there should be no wiggle room for these disgusting jerks to harass, intimidate, and assault women with impunity as long as they're financially powerful, right? If we have laws against this, then those should also apply. There shouldn't be a way to get out of it with an NDA. So violence against women is another issue that's not taken seriously from a legal perspective around the world. There's a lot of countries that just don't have any legal protections for women or anyone who faces abuse at all. So if we want equitable societies, we need strong protections and condemnations of violence against women, when instead we get all sorts of social excuses and justifications for that violence. Another thing that was talked about was feminist transformations of human rights. So this means transforming the human rights concept from a feminist perspective so it can help women's lives. And these transformations can be taken on any issue in relation to gender, but most have focused solely on issues that are really troubling, like forced marriage, compulsory heterosexuality, and female genital mutilation. So the practical applications of transforming the human rights concept from that feminist perspective, it needs to be further explored. And again, it is intersectional, as most women can experience, also experience all those other issues that are human rights issues related to their race, their class, their nation, their age, their sexual preference, their politics. And trying to segment these experiences loses the larger picture of how these inequalities are related and complicatedly intertwined with each other, right? So using a intersectionality or feminist approach to women's rights as human rights is key to understanding the social mechanisms of human rights issues around the world, right? And we can't address them if we don't understand them, right? And we have to be able to understand the complex ways that social beliefs and those patriarchal notions really combine to create complicated systems of interlocking inequalities. And so that needs to be further explored and really refined so that we can find logical solutions to end these injustices and make sure that there's equitable treatment across the world.